Hello everyone, my name is Akansh Shrinani and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism, late autism diagnosis, and autism in women and girls. I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists and seek their views and updates on their latest work and research. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. Lastly, keeping inclusivity as a topmost priority, we might also discuss controversial disparate views for a collective understanding of issues and respect for diverse views. All the views and topics discussed are for informational purposes only. If you are interested in watching more quality content on this topic, please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to press the bell icon to be notified whenever a new video is uploaded. Please also share the channel with your friends, family, and social media platforms. Thank you. Miss Katie Oswald is an accomplished autistic entrepreneur and self-advocate who was diagnosed later in life. As the executive director of the nonprofit Full Spectrum Agency, she is committed to promoting neurodiversity and supporting the autistic community. Her advocacy has amplified the voices of many autistic adults, with a focus on empowering individuals on the spectrum, creating inclusive environments, and championing the rights and recognition of autistic people. Ms. Oswald and her team have led numerous innovative programs designed to assist autistic individuals in feeling a sense of belonging and living a more self-determined life. Ms. Oswald, welcome and thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you, Akansh. Thanks for having me.
And to kind of jump right into it, can you
Yeah.
share your journey of being diagnosed as autistic later in life? How did this diagnosis impact your personal and professional life?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I got diagnosed when I was 38, and it wasn't that much of a surprise to me. I always had kind of felt like something was a little bit off, and I identified with in some ways when I learned about autistic people and autistic characters in the media. But we didn't really like think anything of it, and so it it took a long time for me to get to where I like connected with somebody who was a therapist that had expertise in diagnosing adults. And I think in terms of like it really impacted the direction I took after that, because for personally it was very affirming to kind of have a understanding of why I felt those differences and why I felt like um, somewhat like not accepted by society. And so it was a little bit like really affirming for me. And I know there's like mixed feelings, and I think you have this as a separate question, but I'll address it a little bit now as I'm talking about this too. Like in terms of whether people choose to get the diagnosis as an adult, that's a really personal choice to make that's different for everybody. And looking back on my diagnosis, sometimes in some ways, I feel grateful that I had it. In some ways, I'm like, I don't know if I really needed that, because, I can feel good about myself as an autistic person with or without a diagnosis. Um, and it didn't really impact, like, in terms of services that I have access to. So, there's things like Americans with Disabilities Act, where, you can have certain protections in the workplace and things like that, and potentially be able to apply for social security and disability. But, overall, there's not a lot of services for adults. And so personally, for me, it was more of like the affirmation, and professionally, obviously, it helped me quite a bit, because like similar to you, Akansh, like I realized I had a passion for this kind of work. Before that, I was working, my educational background was in statistics and economics, and I was really struggling with autistic burnout, and not really understanding, what that meant. And then after I got diagnosed, it really kind of happened by chance. I was looking for, what do I do next? Like, what are the next steps to take after diagnosis? And there really weren't any, and there weren't any services for adults. And what I really wanted was to be able to find a group of folks like me, that I could learn from. And so that's what kind of influenced me to start Full Spectrum Agency. It really started as a meetup group, very informal, but there were so many folks that came to us after that because we created a space for people to feel a sense of belonging. And things have just really grown exponentially from there. So in a lot of ways, it really has influenced my professional life, even more than my personal life.
What do you think the key signs or experiences that led you to suspect you might be autistic um,
Mhm.
later in life were? Do you attribute your late diagnosis to masking?
To some extent, yeah. And I think a lot of people don't know what masking is. So, masking in the autism community, it's different than like people will say, well, everybody does that to some extent. They cover up, certain aspects of their identity. Um, like for example, a work persona. A lot of people go to work and they're different at work than they are when they're with their friends. And that's true, but it can be quite a bit more than that for autistic folks. So whether or not I think we have a diagnosis, there's a lot of masking that goes on. And so there's that pressure by society to kind of conform to neurotypical ways of being. And so that can start so young for so many folks that I think you don't even realize that it's happening. Um, I think that happened to me, and I'm still kind of unpacking that. And this is where some of the value of having this community of autistic adults that can get together, like this is the value in that, because I'm hearing other people's stories around my own age range about how they never realized they were even masking, and hearing them talk about this process of unmasking where they've been kind of living as almost somebody else and not even being aware of their true identity for so many years. And this process of unmasking that I'm starting to see that in myself in a lot of ways. So and having folks to go and talk about that with is really valuable. But yeah, when you are kind of, whether you're forced to or it just happens naturally, I think for a lot of us it just happens naturally, starting to kind of succumb to those pressures of society to, cover up traits and characteristics that are considered undesirable, and pretend to be somebody else. You can, how can you find that in yourself, that true self that might be an autistic identity? So I think for sure, for me, that was a big part of it, of figuring out who I am. Um, and there's things that I can look back on now and see that they were signs that I didn't necessarily recognize at the time. Um, I think mostly the burnout and the overwhelm, the sensory experience, of overwhelm is a very, very common thread for autistic folks. And there's obviously a lot more to it than that. Um, the communication differences and things like that I can look back on now and recognize as signs that I didn't necessarily pick up on. We see the signs of what most people consider to be like classical autism that we see in characters like Rain Man, and that are kind of described in the DSM-5. But there's experiences that autistic people have that so many of us have that aren't really widely discussed. And I think autistic burnout, I had a 3-year autistic burnout. And at the time, I didn't know what was wrong with me, but kind of looking back now, that makes a lot more sense.
How did you feel leading up to your diagnosis? And
Yeah.
how did you feel once you got the result?
I felt really grateful and actually pretty relieved, because at the time that I went for my diagnosis, like things in my life were kind of falling apart yet again. And so a little bit of my background, like I had my autistic burnout was right after high school, because high school was the social environment and the sensory environment was too much and too long. And um, after coping with that for so many years, I couldn't function anymore. So towards the end of high school and a few years after that, I was completely shut down, and I didn't understand what was wrong with me. Um, at some point you just start to feel like a loser because you don't understand why other people are able to do things so easily, that people consider to be, easy, and that are not for you, because maybe you struggle with executive functioning and things like that and sensory overwhelm. Once I came out of that and was able to go to college and accomplish things that I never dreamed at the point of my burnout that I would be able to accomplish. I tried to start a career, and then I ended up in the same kind of situation as I did in high school, where, it was just too much. The social, the social aspects and the sensory, environmental aspects of the work life, 9 to 5, I couldn't do, and I didn't know. I didn't know at that time that I could ask for accommodations. So I was, my career that I attempted after all that work of recovering from the burnout and going to college and Peace Corps and grad school, and feeling like I could do anything like that, that started to collapse around me. And it started to feel very familiar as like I felt after high school. So that's when I found the therapist who specialized in autistic adults, and she had an autistic child, and she just understood it in a way that none of the other therapists I'd ever been to did. So I was very, very grateful, to have connected with somebody just by chance that could really help me. And I felt, a little bit relieved that I understood there was a reason for some of the struggles I had, and it didn't just mean that I was a loser and that I couldn't do things. Like I can, and I have, and I'm doing things in a way that work for me now, that honor my, my sensory challenges and my communication challenges. I don't know that I would have been able to do that if I hadn't at least connected with that therapist. I think was the best thing. And the diagnosis itself, I don't know, it's kind of a toss up. Like I feel like I feel really good about who I am with or without a diagnosis, but it's that whole process was really empowering for me.
How did the diagnostic process affect your self-identity and
Yeah.
the way you view your past experiences?
Yeah, absolutely helped me view myself not as broken, but as just different, I think, and embrace my autism as part of my a core part of who I am, and not as something that was wrong with me that needed fixing. And I really think that the process I went through with the therapist was more helpful in that than the diagnostics itself was. And I should clarify that I went through the diagnosis at a different agency than my therapist was at. My therapist could have diagnosed me, but she wanted me to go to a bigger agency that had, more resources and things like that. Um, so I think that part of the process was not as empowering as like going to the therapist who specialized in autism, but that whole time of my life going through that experience was very empowering in terms of like embracing who I was, rather than thinking like, God, there's something wrong with me. Like, why can't I be like everybody else? And I'm who I'm supposed to be. And it did clarify so much about my past, like so much. And I hear that from a lot of my peers too. Like once they either realize they're autistic, some people choose not to go through diagnostics and or get their diagnosis, like that clarity looking back on your life of like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense now. Like I'm having the same struggles as all these other autistic people, and it's okay. Like it doesn't mean that something's wrong with me. It means society is not set up in a way that works well for some people.
What advice would you give to other adults who might be considering seeking a diagnosis but are unsure if it's the right step for them?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider, and I think I should unpack this a little bit more. So glad that we're covering this. There's the cost associated with it. So there's not a lot of in the US anyway, there's not a lot of insurance coverage for adults. So if you're past, some of the cutoffs come at 21, some at like 26, depending on what service we're talking about, but a lot of insurance won't cover it. And people are being asked to pay upwards of like $4,500 out of pocket, which if you know, we have a community that has like 80 to 90% unemployment and underemployment. We've got a significant, I would say, majority in the autistic community living at or below the poverty line. $4,500 is a lot of money, even if you're not, even if you're above the poverty line, that's a lot. So there's that, there's the cost to consider. Um, there's, it's hard to find. It's hard to find places that and professionals that are familiar with recognizing autism in adults. So that can be a challenge because we talked about masking. So what an adult autistic person will look like is very different from what an autistic child will look like. So I think there's a completely different skill set involved in diagnosing adults that not a lot of professionals have, and it's starting to improve, but we do still have a long way to go. And the personal like considerations, like some people, I'll hear a lot of folks say, I don't need a professional to tell me that I'm autistic. So for those of us who view our autism more as part of our identity, we can make the comparison of being gay. Like it would be absurd for an adult to have to go to a professional for them to tell you, oh yes, we've run all these studies and we do, you definitely are gay. Like, it's crazy to think about that kind of thing. But, and I know like a lot of folks are thinking about it from the medical perspective, but for a lot of us, our autism is part of who we are. It's part of our identity. So for a lot of folks don't really feel like they need a professional to validate part of their identity and who they are. And others do feel like they need to I mentioned a couple of the benefits that, in theory you can get from a diagnosis, and it's, coverage under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's questionable how well that works in practice in terms of how well it protects people at work and other settings. There is also, you could potentially then be able to apply for benefits like SSI and SSDI if you needed them. And the other one that I didn't mention that is kind of a big one is you could then get access to services through community mental health. That can qualify you for community mental health and be able to get, go through that individualized plan of service, person-centered planning process and get access through Medicaid to some of those services. So it's a lot to think about. And I think, an individual thinking about that can think through all of that stuff and talk to their family and talk to their peers, talk to their therapist, and think about the pros and cons and if that's the right decision for them. I'll mention too that the process of diagnosing an adult can feel for a lot of adults to be a little bit demeaning and a little bit like kind of infantilizing, because a lot of the processes used are designed for little kids. And I'll give the example of, well, I think overall, like the process being such a medical process, and if you are someone who thinks of your autism as a part of your identity, for it to be kind of approached as a flaw or a set of flaws or deficits in itself can be kind of demeaning. But specifics about the process too, like I had to go sit with a therapist and like read through a children's book. Like I think it was even one of those like little cardboard books that you read with like a 2-year-old or 3-year-old. It was a bizarre thing to be asked to do at 38 years old.
And regarding autistic burnout, which you experienced for 3 years and then again later, can you please explain what it is, what it feels like, why it might happen, and what can be done to prevent it, and what the causes are?
Yeah, yep. And I'll try to remember all of those things, but if I miss any aspects of it, let me know. So like the way it's different than general burnout, and I think I found a really great resource. There's a couple great resources too, for anyone who wants to like learn more about autistic burnout beyond what we discussed today, like there's a great paper by Dr. Dora Raymaker that came out into the year, I think it was in 2020, and I can't remember the name of it, but there's also the website Embrace Autism has a great summary based on that paper about like the differences between general burnout or classical burnout and autistic burnout. So if you kind of Google those something along those lines for Embrace Autism, you should be able to find that. Um, what what is different about general burnout and autistic burnout? Autistic burnout does tend to last significantly longer, and it's a buildup of like this chronic overload and overwhelm over time. So for me, it was all those years of school, which for most people, school can be stressful and things like that, but um, that bombardment on my senses every day for 12 years, kind of, even with the summer breaks, was like wore on me over time. The a lot of people talk about autistic burnout as, and I like those way of framing it, like um, this kind of chronic, like the demands on you as the individual are way more than you can keep up with, and it kind of stacks up on you. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but until you kind of collapse under the weight of all those expectations that you're not able to meet. And um, I think one of the big differences between classical burnout and autistic burnout is not only just like the how long it can last, and they say 3+ months, but for me and for others I've talked to has been significantly longer. You kind of just collapse and can hardly function at all, including like for it kind of looks a little bit more like severe depression, which can occur with burnout, but they're not the same thing. But it can look the same in the fact that, like, you might not even be able to get out of bed some days. You might not be able to formulate words all of the time, even if you are generally someone who communicates verbally with speech. And you can lose like life skills, and for some folks those don't come back, like being able to manage your activities of daily living, and like communication skills and things like that you can that you may have gained those skills over time. You can lose those skills and sometimes not regain them. And I think, for me, I couldn't force myself. If I tried to force myself, like a lot of times people will try to give you a solution of like, just, get out of bed and kind of push yourself and go like outside and like interact with people. And you really have to think about like your needs, and like maybe that might help for some people, but for some of us, like, that was what led up to the burnout in the first place, is too much sensory overload and too much interacting with folks and just that bombardment on our system. So kind of pushing yourself to go back out into that same situation can sometimes slow down your progress, like out of burnout. So for me, it was just giving myself the time and the space that I needed. And I didn't know this at the time. So I'm like, I just learned this as I went, that, if I tried to push myself too hard while I was burned out, I would collapse all over again. And so the thing that most of us have found helps with burnout is time. Unfortunately, there's not like a magic wand or like a magic solution, and each individual is going to be different. So for some of us, you might be able to take baby steps and go back out into the world, and each of us has to figure out for ourselves like whether that's true or not, and not listen to what other people think is the best for us always, because we know ourselves best. I think I was going to say something else about burnout, and I can't remember. Oh, prevention. Yeah. So prevention really is understanding your needs, your limitations. Like, now I structure my life in a way where I have the breaks that I need. I don't overschedule my day. I schedule transition time right um into my day so that I can not burn out. Um, Society has a way of making you feel like you don't have a right to do that. We're supposed to be going all the time. We're supposed to be saying yes to everything. We're supposed to be like giving 110% at work. But if it's going to push you into a long-term burnout, that's you have to think about like, is that really worth it? And so for me, and I think for so many of my peers, like prevention is just understanding yourself, self-awareness, and knowing, how to not push yourself. People will talk about spoons, managing your spoons. I don't know if you're familiar with that analogy, um, but it's spoons are like units of energy. So we all, start with a certain amount of spoons that last us through the day. And if we go through all of our spoons, then we are out of energy. And so we have to find some way to kind of rest and recuperate and kind of replenish those units of energy or spoons. So yeah, learning how to do that, because I've heard something recently that I really liked, because a lot of the questions that people have when they go through autistic burnout are like, will I ever be able to get back to what I was how I was functioning before this? And the answer that I heard this doctor say is basically that, no, because like you might, but you maybe shouldn't want to, because that's what led to your burnout in the first place, was pushing yourself past your limits, over and over again over an extended period of time. So the reality is that you were living in a way that is unsustainable for you. And so, maybe thinking about not wanting to get back to like that as your norm, but living in a more sustainable way, basically.
How do you
Yeah.
think your life has changed, like, from before you had autistic burnout to like, after? Um, like I
Mm-hmm.
guess, the thing you mentioned with like, your life won't go back to being the same as it was before
Yeah.
because that's what led you to have that burnout. So,
Yeah. Well, and I didn't learn that lesson right away, right? Because I like still went and did like I almost pushed myself back into burnout with trying to do a traditional career that was 9 to 5, and not realizing that, that kind of lifestyle doesn't work well for me, as I learned um, you know, with my burnout, like my post high school burnout. So um I think now it took me a long time to learn like what like have the self-awareness, I think, for like being able to prevent that burnout and live my life in a more sustainable way. And I will say that like that is still like an ongoing struggle. Like right now, I've taken on quite a bit of work, and I need to kind of always remind myself that I don't want to have to go through that burnout again. So it's an ongoing struggle. And I think in terms of like how it has impacted my life, like I don't know where my life would have gone if I hadn't gone through the burnout and recovered from it, but I think I wouldn't be a happy person. Like I think about like how sometimes things happen for a reason. And I wish there would have been like an easier way than a 3-year burnout for sure. But if I had continued on that trajectory of like living my life in a way that was not very healthy for me, I might have, just gone on straight through to college and grad school and gotten a job that I was miserable at, but still kept getting up um, to go every day. And, some of the coping strategies that I could have ended up with that weren't very healthy, like that wouldn't be very healthy, like drinking to cope and things like that. So I think about how my life maybe would have turned out if I hadn't had that experience. And it was a very unpleasant experience in a lot of ways, but in another way, like it helped me realize that I wasn't living in a way that was sustainable. So I think talking about autistic burnout publicly is really helpful, because it might help more people realize that without having to go through the burnout themselves. So that's always my goal, and sharing my experience is like, can we help people to live a life that's more sustainable, that's, that they're more self-aware without having to go through some of the same struggles that I went through.
It is a fact that autism presents differently in girls and boys, and our community needs to, cater, kind of adapt differently to girls. So, any thoughts or suggestions on that?
Yeah, that's a really big question. And I think what I'm hearing the most about that is that we talked about, my situation with masking, and if I thought that impacted my, that we kind of missed my diagnosis because of that, and a lot of other folks as well. So that's I think the biggest thing to think about with autistic girls and women is that why does it present differently? And so there's a lot of different pressures, like gender norms that we have in our culture for girls, that we're expected to socialize a lot more. And so we might be forcing girls to mask a lot more than we're forcing boys to mask. So that might be one part of it. So I don't know if we didn't have those gender norms and force girls to mask like to such a greater extent, it might look a lot that might look a lot closer to how it presents in boys. So I mean, I think, thinking through the reasons that might happen, but I think for practical purposes, we're not going to change those kind of gender norms overnight. And helping professionals understand that, you know, that we shouldn't just be looking for these signs of classical autism. And I think a lot of that comes from interacting with the autistic community. So at Full Spectrum Agency, for example, like we started out as just having community for autistic folks. And more recently, we've started inviting what we call it our ally group. We have started inviting non-autistic people to some of our stuff because we realized that, people who are not autistic need to learn what autism, like the diversity of what autism can look like for people from interacting directly with autistic people. So that we were talking about the difference between, how it presents in women and how it presents versus how it presents in boys. And that whole structure was built up. If you read the history, and I know you're familiar with Steve Silberman, and I don't know if others have read Steve Silberman's Neurotribes, but learning that history of how we've gotten to here, and it's always been, diagnosing just young white boys primarily was how it was in the 80s. And a lot of the 90s. So people get a stereotype of what they're supposed to be looking for as autism, and then it's not true. So we need to, that's all the more reason for us to be able to integrate into society and be accepted in society as we are, so that people can learn about the diversity of autism, whether it's for, the differences between girls and boys, or, what autism can look like when you're 12 versus what it looks like when you're 65, and a lot of different things as well.
And most autism services and programs were designed with children in mind, and they
Yeah.
may and many people may lose access to most of their support services
Yeah.
at the age of 21. And that change and that shift from, all these support services to basically nothing is very abrupt.
Yeah.
So what changes are necessary to kind of address this gap? And the gap of support services after a person is 21.
Yeah, this is such a huge problem. And I know it's one that we're working on at Autism Alliance through advocacy, and also through our new, we call it My A3 committee. It's our Michigan Adult Autistic Advisory Committee. So, the financial aspect of that, and like that there's a lot of political advocacy that will need to be done to like make sure that we have the resources and the finances to cover services for more people, and that cutoff at 21 is very abrupt, and it's very jarring for folks. It's interesting to think about then in some ways, some of the advantages of having never been diagnosed. Of course, you have like lost access to a lifetime of services, but you don't have that that kind of, having the rug pulled out from under you, so to speak, where like you've been supported all your life and now you're just completely on your own struggling. Um, but that's a completely different topic. But in terms of like, I think understanding. So I think what I'm seeing, what I've been seeing over the last few years is a lot of awareness of autism 3 and a lot of awareness from the perspective of autistic people who have parents, kind of advocating for or with them. But we're completely missing the voices of autistic folks who are struggling on their own to, get the access to the services that they need. Not every autistic person has a parent or guardian who is helping them. And so I think it has to start with understanding. Like we need the structures and the systems that are in place, and the people running those things need to understand that a lot of those decisions are being made based on only a small percentage of um, autistic voices, and it's missing a lot of the um, experience of, like, I think a majority of what is actually the autistic population. And so I don't know if a lot of the folks running things are even aware that there's a lot of people struggling without services that we need. This idea that um, I don't know where this idea came from that we should not need services after 21, and where that number came from, and if it's strictly just a decision made based on systemic resources and lack of resources to help beyond that. I think that also goes back to the history that I've learned mostly about through neurotribes, and that it used to be incorrectly believed that autism is something that happens in childhood, and I don't know what people were thinking, that obviously an autistic person grows up and is still autistic. I think that people were still thinking that there was a cure for it. And that's another whole different conversation, because most of us, now we understand that we shouldn't want a cure for it. It's just a different way of being. So, but it was viewed completely different when all those systems were being built up. And so kind of helping people understand and getting more of autistic voices to, the people who are running those systems, so that we can start to understand the need, and then react to that need. That's another whole discussion, because the resources that would be needed for that. But people have to understand first what the problem is, and that there is a huge need in the autistic adult community.
Why is there a need for meetup groups for autistic adults? What inspired you to start the full spectrum agency?
Well, there's a need because, like, a lot of adults are not finding a sense of belonging anywhere else in society, which is horribly sad. People are not very accepting of autistic people. There's still this wide belief that autism is not the normal way to be, so to speak, like normal, air quotes around normal, because what is normal? Who decides what's normal? So we need society to see that there's not like one correct way to be, and there's room for all of us. But until then, we need interventions to kind of to help that happen, but also primarily to make sure that people have a place where they can go, where they feel a sense of belonging. And that's why stuff that like we're doing at Full Spectrum Agency is so important, because we'll have people come and say, like, oh my gosh, I've never been able to make a friend my entire life until now, and they're in their 50s maybe, and like that's really sad. Those kind of outcomes, those shouldn't be outcomes that people have, that they aren't able to make a friend until they come to a group like ours. And we have people who come and say, like, they just can't believe that something like this exists, and it's like a lifeline for them now. So it's really important to individuals who are struggling to feel like they fit in society, and there's not a place where they do fit, to have that experience where they're seeing that, hey, there are other people like me, and it's okay for us to to be who we are.
What do you think the most pressing issues facing the adult autistic community are today?
There's a lot, and I think they're all rooted in the fact that society doesn't accept autism as a different but equal, and it views autism as being lesser than and something that needs like training to so that people can act be more neurotypical. So those flawed ways of thinking about autism, I think, are at the root of all of most, if not all, of the challenges. But the challenges that I'm seeing um, that I think are really huge and need to be solved at a systemic level are the unemployment and underemployment, including for folks like me who have an advanced degree but can't stay employed. We have an 80 to 90% unemployment rate. Like there's a lot of interventions that are intended for people who don't have the education, and we're starting to see some interventions to help folks find employment, if even if the for those who do have education. um, but there's a lot that needs to be done with that in terms of like retention. People are getting hired, I think, into jobs oftentimes, but they're not able to get the accommodations they need to be able to make that work. And so what I hear from my peers more than anything is like, I, I'm still struggling with the social aspects of work. So we need accommodations around that, understanding of people, employers and staff who are understanding and understand autism. Um, and I'm also hearing from folks like, I can stay at a job for like a year to 2 years ish, and then I hit the wall and I can't make it work anymore. So how do we, structure accommodations in a way that can help people stay in a job and continue earning income without burning out? I think that's a big issue. And that's connected to other issues that I'm seeing. There's a much higher rate of homelessness in the autism community than there is in the general community. So, and that's all interconnected with the unemployment challenges and the poverty challenges. So that's a big part. That's a big one. And I would also say the mental health uh, challenges. We also have an extremely high suicide rate compared to the general population, and that's not okay. I've seen, depending on what study you look at, like anywhere between 5 times and 11 times higher suicide rate. And it seems to, the majority of the studies seem to land around 9 times more likely for an autistic person to attempt or commit suicide than the general population. So why is that happening? I think a lot of it has to do with not being accepted by society and maybe spending a whole lifetime of, people trying to train your autism out of you and like make you act like more like they want you to act. But yeah, we're seeing like a lot of unfortunate mental health outcomes like PTSD and some trauma. And a lot of that, when you talk to people, they're expressing that they had a bad or a series of bad experiences in childhood of like people trying to force them to not be autistic. And so that's a big part of it. There's probably a lot more I could say, but those are the ones that come to mind. And it all, I think it all is rooted in this this idea, this lack of belonging. People, if we push people to the outskirts of society and not accept them for who they are, like we will have bad outcomes, and we need to work on that, as a society.
To kind of solve this problem, I guess, how can families and communities better support autistic individuals?
Yeah, I think learning about autism from autistic people, and I think interacting with adults who are autistic and learning what their life has been like and what has been helpful for them and not helpful for them. I'd like to see a program similar to, and I don't know that Full Spectrum has the capacity to do this right now, but like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, like an autistic version of that, where families who have little kids who are autistic, like work directly with, an autistic adult peer mentor, where they can learn about that lived experience and kind of learn better ways to, prevent meltdowns and communicate and learn your child's unique language, because your child might be trying to say something to you with their body language. We hear that a lot in our community about, like, I, as a little kid, I was always trying to communicate, my frustration or like an unmet need, and everybody was ignoring, because they weren't communicating in a way that was expected of them. So learning to understand your child's like communication style and language, and the cues that they give off, um, when they're getting overwhelmed, for example, and how to prevent that. I think you can learn a lot from an autistic adult who has been through a lot of those similar situations. And so I think families should, instead of always just listening to professionals who have learned about autism from a textbook, or a training that was designed by non-autistic people, talk to autistic people and learn from us. I think that's really important.
What message would you like to share with non-autistic allies who want to support the autistic community?
Yeah, I think the same thing I was talking about before, is to listen to us, get involved, learn how to be more accessible and inclusive in your day-to-day life, and prioritize that. And not just for autistic people, but for everybody. We shouldn't have groups of people in our society who are constantly being excluded. And we have to learn how to be individually. We think about inclusion and accessibility in terms of events and like workplaces, but each of us as an individual can learn how to be more inclusive and accessible in our life, and how to make our home more inclusive for different folks. And it comes down to compassion and empathy, and being willing to accept people who are different from you. What was the question again? I forgot the question.
What message would you like to share with non-autistic allies who want to support
Yeah.
the autistic community?
Yeah, I think that everything I just said, and to also remember that autism is, for a lot of us, just a different way of being. And um, we shouldn't want to fix people. We should accept people for who they are, as long as it's not hurting anybody. So I think I'd tell people that too.
Miss Oswald, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and congratulations on all the amazing things you've done. All
Thank
the
you.
success you've achieved. So yeah, thank you very much for,
You're
making the
welcome.
time to do this. And, it was amazing. I learned a lot.
I'm glad. Thank you. And thank you for having me.